Excellent. You are, I'm traveling, and you are the first person that I have talked to today. So it's very
Lucky
important that
me.
it's very important that my first conversation of the day is broadcast across the whole world. That's no pressure at all.
Thank you very much. So our guest is Chester Fritz, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and the Director of the Institute for Philosophy in Public Life at the University of North Dakota. He's the host of the public radio show and podcast that is called Why? Philosophical Discussions about Everyday Life. Why Radio for short. It is currently in its 12th season. He's the author of many books and dozens of articles, and he has edited at least 6 collections. Professor Jack Russell Weinstein, welcome to Live Show.
Oh, thank you very much. And as always, thank you for asking me to join you. These conversations with you and with your colleagues are among my favorite part of my job.
Thank you. For almost a century in West, democracy has meant liberal democracy, a political system marked not only by free and fair elections, but also by liberal values. Liberalism applied to the problem of the limits of the criminal law would require commitments to the presumption in favor of liberty. If the word liberal is to have any utility in this context, it should refer to one who has so powerful commitment to liberty that she is motivated to limit the number of acknowledged liberty limiting or coercion legitimizing principles as narrow as possible. So she only believes in harm principle, maybe, as the morally relevant reason for criminal prohibitions. Offense principle and paternalistic and moralistic considerations, when introduced as support for penal legislation, have no weight at all. So it means autonomy and self-regarding versus other regarding distinction, based on which the human is the owner of her mind and body, and everything consenting adults do is beyond the realm of morality and law. It leads to individual basic rights and liberties, such as basic rights and liberties of speech, religion, and property, and collective basic rights and liberties, such as basic rights and liberties of assembly, for example, civil society, NGOs, and the other basic rights and liberties. Democratically elected leaders can routinely ignore these liberties and constitutional limits on their power and deprive their citizens of basic rights and liberties. The two strands of liberal democracy have been coming apart in the world and also in the US. And the liberal elements of democracy have been fraying and eroding. Even before the US presidential election in 2016. Even before that election, there was already much discussion of a crisis of liberal democracy. In particular, there has been a debate about whether liberalism and democracy, which had long been assumed to go together, were becoming decoupled. So, I would like to ask you, Jack, about this question. Are they becoming decoupled in the world and specifically in the United States?
Well, first of all, I think that I could teach an entire semester's course on that question because you started off by describing the situation as free and fair elections in a liberal democracy. But I think that there is already a question in the United States and certainly across the world as to whether there are free elections, whether there are fair elections, and exactly what a democracy means, even though you want to focus on the idea of liberalism. I also think that the world has seen since the late 70s and early 80s a shift in some respects to the right. In social policy, the world has moved to the left, has been more permissive of different conceptions of sexuality, more permissive in terms of media, more permissive in terms of certain kinds of free speech. But in other ways, particularly in the definition of liberty, it's moved further and further towards the libertarian interpretation of liberty, which is the account that you're offering, which is a liberty that respects only the harm principle, a liberty that describes the autonomy. And of course, you know as well as I do that three things happened around that period. You had the Iranian Revolution, which changed the Muslim world profoundly. You had the election of Ronald Reagan, and you had the election of Margaret Thatcher in England. And so you got a radical shift in what the liberal West, I don't like that word, but the liberal West thought of as liberty, and you got a radical shift in what the Muslim world thought of as acceptable limitations on liberty. And so I think these three forces interacted to give us an economic model of liberty that was not taken for granted beforehand. There are other, let me stop because I know you want to do some translating. So let me stop there for a moment and then I'll continue.
Thank you very much. فرمودن که اگر بخواهیم به این پرسش پاسخ بدیم یک ترم طول میکشه. پرسش این بود که آیا لیبرالیسم و دموکراسی که حدوداً 100 سال دوش همدیگر حرکت کردن دارن از همدیگر در غرب و به ویژه در ایالات متحده آمریکا جدا میشن یا نه. ایشون در پاسخ فرمودن که خب اولا این یک ترم طول میکشه تا پاسخ بدن. ثانیاً فرمودن که پاسخ موکول به این است که اولا بفهمیم دموکراسی چیست و شروع کردن درباره گرایش جهان به سمت حرکت‌های دست راستی و احزاب افراطی دست راست رو توضیح دادن. Thank you, Jack.
So, one complaint about the libertarian notion of liberty is that it isn't a fair depiction of families, right? So if you think of John Rawls and other in this line of thought, they're often criticized by thinking of families as represented by one head of the family. But we know that the head of the family isn't always altruistic, that there are internal conflicts in the family, that sometimes the head of the family is selfish or abusive, and that other people in the family don't have their voices represented. So whatever liberty has to be in the modern world, it has to allow for more than just an atomistic view of the world. It has to allow for joint projects, for lack of a term. The second thing is that, and you'll be familiar, and I would suspect your students are familiar too, with the debate between Isaiah Berlin and, for example, Charles Taylor, the debate between negative liberty and positive liberty, where Berlin sees the core of liberty as freedom from, but rejects the idea of freedom to, seeing it as Hegelian, Marxist, collectivist, all of these ideas. Whereas Charles Taylor says the freedom to get an education is meaningless unless you have the freedom to cultivate your capacities to do something with an education. So even before we answer the basic question of whether the two things are being decoupled, I think we have to recognize that if we define liberty in terms of the very narrow description that you offered, we've already set the rules up to undermine some of the central values of liberal democracy. We'll call them the democratic virtues: loyalty, courage, intellectual curiosity, the ability to stand up and speak for yourself, the ability to advocate for people who don't have voices. This is something that does not get a lot of attention, but is tremendously important. Right? I think part of what you and I do when we have these conversations, when your colleague Kaveh and I also have these conversations, is we are advocating for our communities. Right? We know that we have respect and admiration for each other, and so we can overcome the geopolitical hostilities and say, let's be a part of this joint project. And what's happening in the United States is that one side of the debate, the conservative Republican side, has given up the responsibility for advocating for others. This is one of, I don't know that I want to say it's the central problem, but it's certainly a candidate for the central problem in the United States, that the Republicans have given up advocating for people without voices, and they're only interested in things that affect them. And so what you get is this nonsensical battle about whether to wear masks or not, but also a whole litany of representatives who are opposed to gay rights until one of their children comes out as gay, or opposed to mask mandates until they themselves get sick, or opposed to something else until something happens. When you have such a large segment of the population who has given up their right to advocate for people who can't speak for themselves, then you get a crumbling of, we would say, the penumbra, but the network of concepts that surround liberty, that give liberty its value and its meaning.
Thank you, Jack. در مرحله دوم پاسخ ایشون میفرمایند که خب حالا بایستی آزادی رو معنی کنیم. فرمودن این تعریفی که تو، یعنی من، از آزادی ارائه کردم یک تعریف خیلی نازکی از آزادیه و اشاره کردم به اون تمایزی که آیزا برلین بین آزادی منفی و آزادی مثبت ارائه میکنه و گفتن که حتما همه دانشجوها میدونن که آزادی مثبت و آزادی منفی چه فرقی داره و گفتن که جمهوری خواها در امریکا دارن به سمتی میرن که صدای بی صداها رو نمیشنون و این نوع تعریف از آزادی باعث میشه که در نهایت خود لیبرال دموکراسی هم فرو بپاشه و ارزش‌هایی مثل لویالتی، وفاداری و ارزش‌های اجتماعی که در پرتو اون وجود داره از بین برن. Jack, thank you.
May I ask you a question? I wish that I spoke Persian, but in your description, you use the phrase liberal democracy in its English iteration, although you say it with a Persian accent. Is there a translation of liberal democracy in Persian? And is that translation, does it impose cultural assumptions and cultural baggage, we would say in English, that the English version does not? If there is an Iranian version of the phrase liberal democracy, is it inherently Iranian? And if so, what would that teach us about the phrase or the concept?
A very smart question. Thank you, Jack. میپرسن که آیا لیبرال دموکراسی هیچ ترجمه‌ای به زبان فارسی شده یا نه. Actually, those who want to be loyal to the word try not to translate the word into Persian. But those who want to use the word based on some local things try to translate it. For example, that is the case for democracy as well. we use democracy, but the people who want to use democracy for Islamic Republic, they call it a religious democracy. But they don't use the word democracy. They translate it into Mardom Salari. So actually, those who want to add something local to the word, translate it. But those who want to be neutral or maybe Western do not translate the word.
It's interesting because part of the question there is, in a democracy, who counts as a legitimate voice, right? Who counts as worthy of voting? And if the phrase ends up being translated as religious democracy, I would assume that you'd have a different definition, right? And I actually was just writing something this week about the 12th century debate between Ibn Rushd, Maimonides, and then eventually Augustine about translating the scripture, and Ibn Rushd's notion that there are three paths to the truth, that the philosopher, that the theologian, and the common person all read the Quran and the scripture differently, that the place of allegory as opposed to literal truths. And I am sure you know infinitely better than I that his argument is that the scripture has to meet people where they are, and that the philosopher and the theologian can read the allegorical interpretation, whereas the commoner has to read the literal interpretation. But if that's the case, then does it delegitimize the voice of the commoner? If the commoner isn't educated enough and reflective enough to understand and interpret the poetic meaning of the scripture, does that devalue their voice in a democracy? And so I guess the question, that I'm putting on the table is, when you use the English translation of liberal democracy, the presumption is everyone gets to speak and participate, and the burden of proof is to show who shouldn't have that right. But if you have, as you describe it, the Persian definition of democracy, then the presumption is only some people get to speak, and the burden of proof is on people who want to join that conversation. And I think that that's a central fault line, dividing line between the two traditions, is that the default of liberal democracy is that everyone gets to participate unless there's a reason that they shouldn't. And other traditions historically, and not just obviously the Iranian tradition, but other traditions historically have had the exact opposite presumption.
Let me translate for my audience. میگن که اینکه ترجمه کنیم واژه دموکراسی یا واژه لیبرالیسم یا واژه‌های مثل این رو، این با خودش یک بار معنایی وارد زبان خواهد کرد و اونایی که ترجمه نمی‌کنن دلیلی دارن و اونایی که ترجمه هم نمی‌کنن ترجمه می‌کنن و نمی‌کنن دلیلی دارن. و افزون بر این فرمودن که دو پیش‌فرض میتونیم داشته باشیم، اینکه همه در دموکراسی رأی دارن و حرفی برای گفتن دارن مگر اینکه خلافش ثابت بشود، یا اینکه پیش‌فرض دیگر اینکه نخیر، فقط یک عده خاصی حق رأی دارند و حق دخالت دارند مگر اینکه خلافش ثابت بشود. And Jack, between these two presumptions, tell me, what do you think can be the criterion?
Well, this is yet another one of the central questions in the United States right now, because again, the Republican Party is trying to limit voting access, while the Democratic Party is trying to widen voting access. And the criteria for the Republicans are power, and the criteria for the Democrats is access. Right? I mean, that's an oversimplification, and I'm revealing some of my political views by saying it, but I think that I can defend that position. So what's the criteria? In a traditional liberal democracy, the criteria is the ability to be rational, the ability to make judgments for oneself.
In Rawlsian sense.
Yes, and then depending on where you go with it is the criteria of being reasonable. So to be rational is I'll use again John Rawls's language. To be rational is to be able to have a sense of the good of your life and to order those goods, right? So this is what I want, and this is more important than this, and this is more important than this, and this is more important than this. But to be reasonable is to have a reciprocal relationship with someone, and to say, if
maybe the ability to justify that.
It's not reasonable. It requires justification, although it depends on the theorist as to who. But even before justification is the reciprocal relationship that says, I always tell my students, the central lesson of modern ethics is that you're not special. that what is true of you is true of everyone else. The right that you have is the right that they have. The responsibilities that you have are the responsibilities that they have, and the other way around. And so if I have freedom of speech, it's only reasonable to say that you have freedom of speech. If I have freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of reproductive rights, then it is only reasonable to say that you have them as well. And so if you are advocating for your or someone else's voting rights, then if you're not advocating for everyone's voting rights, you're not being reasonable.
Thank you. Is that what John Rawls called reflective equilibrium?
Not quite. This comes out more in the second book, in Political Liberalism. Reflective equilibrium is actually very, very interesting. It's the idea that we have moral principles that we can justify, and we have intuitions that inspire us to act, and what the political deliberation is moving back and forth, working, we would say in logic, working both ends to the middle until you get a point of equilibrium that represents authentically the principle and authentically your intuition. And that then leads to the original position and technical stuff in the book. I think that to translate that to non-political philosophers, it's the difference between being told what's right. Let me put that. It's the difference between a tradition that articulates what's right and your experience of what's right, or I should say good, because it's Rawls, the experience of what's good, and then trying to meet in the middle. But it's a moral psychological principle as opposed to a political justification. So.
Thank you, Jack. خب من پرسیدم که اگر اینطوریه پس یعنی این گروه هم حرف خودش رو داره، این گروه هم حرف خودش رو داره و هر گروهی حرف خودش رو در دموکراسی میزنه، ملاک چی هست؟ فرمودن که ملاک توانایی عقلایی بودن، خردمند بودن یعنی rational و بخردانه بودن یا معقول بودن یعنی being reasonable هست. و در ادامه پرسیدم که آیا این همون رفلکتیو اکویلیبریوم جان رالز هست که فرمودن نه دقیقاً. افزون بر این فرمودن که لب لباب و جان کلام اخلاق مدرن این است که میگه، من هم به دانشجوی خودم میگم که شما سپیشال نیستید، شما تافته جدا بافته نیستید. Jack, may I ask you a $64 million question?
If it's what I think you're going to ask, my answer is I don't know.
But really, people are here not to hear about philosophical things,
yes,
but hear about the result of the election.
you had said in the original message that you were going to ask me who was going to win. And the answer, of course, is I don't know. And this is a hard question because if you talk to political scientists, what they will say is the election of Donald Trump didn't follow, in 2016, didn't match any of the models. All the predictive models, all of the things that political science professors had been teaching their students, we have a very good friend who really laments about this, just get thrown out the window. No one saw this coming. I think that's untrue, but I know that'll be a follow-up question. So we have lots of polling data to suggest that Biden has a strong lead. But we also know, first, that the polls failed, largely failed in 2016. They didn't completely fail because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and she didn't win the electoral vote, which is a crazy thing about the American system. But it really underestimated the appeal of Trump, I think in part because people were embarrassed when they supported Trump. I don't think people are embarrassed now. I think people are very, very proud of following Trump because he is such a charismatic cult-like figure. It's a cult of personality. And so there's a pride and an arrogance about following him that didn't exist in 2016. So the polls are not necessarily accurate, but also there are questions that have actually been in front of our Supreme Court as to how to navigate the fact that a huge portion of Americans now are voting via the mail, right, because of the pandemic. And so
90 million.
Yeah, 90 million. I mean, we're almost at the number of people who have voted last in 2016. And presumably millions and millions and millions of people are going to vote on Tuesday. Historically, the American voting rate during presidential elections is about 50%, which is humiliating to admit, but nevertheless. And they think it's going to far exceed that. So if we were just counting all the votes, I would feel more confident in saying, well, I think perhaps Joe Biden is going to win. But because so much effort is being put in undermining the early vote and undermining the mail-in vote, and because polling access has been so limited, particularly in Democratic areas, your guess is as good as mine. And that's terrifying. There will be a time when all of this is fascinating. There will be a time when the theorists can sit down and have academic debates about the nature of what went wrong and what went right. But right now, the central question of the United States is, will there be a coup d'etat on Tuesday? And the difference is that in many countries, a coup is obvious. It's not subtle. There's military. They shoot people. They take over the radio station or the television station. There is violence in the street. But in the United States, a coup d'etat happens in the courts. And a coup d'etat happens in the judgment of the regional courts and then eventually the Supreme Court that allows them to change the laws and change the criteria. And what was the number I heard? Any challenge about elections, about election law right now that goes to court has, I think the number, and I apologize if I'm wrong. but I think it's 44% chance that it will go to a judge appointed by Donald Trump. So almost half of the federal judges or the circuit judges in the United States have been appointed in the last 3 years.
And I've heard that he has changed 200 judges during these 4 years.
Yeah, something like that, yes. And so if they rule against otherwise legal practices or accepted practices, then it's legal, but it's not in any way, shape, or form justified. And so the danger is that if there is a coup d'etat on Tuesday, there is no remedy unless there is some form of violence. But the coup itself will be the least violent part of the process.
Thank you. پرسیدم که میتونم سوال 64 میلیون دلاریم رو بپرسم. فرمودن که اگر سوالتون چیزیه که من حدس میزنم نمیدونم. خب سوال درباره این بود که نتیجه انتخابات چه خواهد شد. طبق میدونید که فرمودن نظرسنجی ها قابل اتکا نیستن، نظرسنجی ها رو بایستی ریخت بیرون و این رو در قضیه هیلاری به ما نشون داد. ولی اون چیزی که ایشون میگن میترسن این است که اگر ترامپ رای بیاره در روز سه‌شنبه در ایالات متحده امریکا، رسما یک کودتا در امریکا اتفاق افتاده، با این تفاوت که کودتا در جاهای دیگر با توپ و تانک و نیروی نظامی در خیابونها اتفاق میفته، اما او به طریق دیگر این کار رو کرده. مثلا 200 قاضی رو تا الان تغییر داده. میتونید ترکیب سوپریم کورت هم 6-3 هست و به این ترتیب کل قوانین رو میتونه تغییر بده و این کمترین چیز خشنیه که میتونه اتفاق بیفته. نکته دیگری که فرمودن این بود که اون عده‌ای که به ترامپ رای میدادن و embarrassed بودن، یعنی شرمنده بودن دور پیش، این دفعه نه، افتخار میکنن اون عده‌ای که به اون رای میدن، به خاطر اینکه یک چهره خیلی کاریزماتیک برای اونها داره و دیگه بحث مرگ و زندگی برای اینها نکاتی بود که به ذهنم ما. Okay, so you think that it is still probable that Donald J. Trump will be your next president as well?
I'd like to say it's possible, not probable. I would like to say there's a organization that works for the New York Times called 538, which is named after the number of electors in the country. And they estimate that there is an 11% chance that Donald Trump will be president.
Only
11%. But of course, right, let's assume this is true. I don't know that it is. That's misleading because, of course, what people hear in their brain is, okay, only 11% of people are going to vote for Trump. But that's not what that means, right? That means that, you know, it is still a reasonable possibility. Lots of things that we do, you know, you see someone, I mean, I don't know how these things work in Iran culturally, but, you know, if I were single and I saw someone that I wanted to date in the hallway and I introduced myself and said, hello, would you like to go have a cup of coffee? An 11% chance that this person would say yes, I would be like, okay, I'm going to try, right? It wouldn't be a 75% chance, but an 11%, if it was a 1% chance, I might try as well, right? So 11% is tremendously high, especially when you're talking about what could very well be the end of American democracy as we are used to understanding it. Now, with that said, I don't think that Donald Trump has caused all of this. I think what Donald Trump has done is given the agents of change permission and cover to do something that they have been trying to do and setting up to do for a very long time. So Donald Trump is not as smart as people like to claim, but he's also not as stupid as people like to claim. What Donald Trump is a person who enables all of those people who were secretly corrupt to be openly corrupt. And that means that someone like Mitch McConnell, who I don't think Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, I don't think Mitch McConnell is corrupt. I think Mitch McConnell is a servant of very bad masters. And so he is more evil than he is corrupt. But Mitch McConnell was always very quiet about being the servant of these masters. And under Trump, he is very open about being servant to these masters. And
maybe rude.
Yes. And that's what Donald Trump does, is he gives people permission to act out on their most base characteristics. So a friend, one of my, my daughter, she is 15. She has a friend who says that her parents were always Republican, Trump's party, but they were never racist until the last few years. Until the last few years, they have become not only more vociferously openly Republican, but they have added racism to the list. And that's a very, very interesting observation, particularly from a 15-year-old, that describes the process of what Donald Trump has done. These folks who I know and who has always been very, very nice to us and certainly very, very nice to our daughter, they have different political values than us. That's fine. But to go from having a different set of political values to absorbing the most insidious aspects of American history, that is shocking and upsetting.
Thank you. میگن که خب نظرسنجی ها 11% احتمال برنده شدن ترامپ رو میدن، اما حرف ایشون چیز دیگری است. میگن این 11% خیلیه. چرا یک جامعه مثل امریکا بایستی به اینجا رسیده باشه که یک کسی مثل دونالد ترامپ هنوز ما در حول و بلا باشیم که این ممکنه رأی بیاره یا رأی نیاره. مقایسه کردن ایشون رو با میچ مک‌کانل. گفتن که کاری که ترامپ میکنه، اولا ترامپ معلول یک اتفاقاتیه که در امریکا در طول این مدت افتاده و کسی بهش توجه نکرده و علتش نیست. اما از طرف دیگر گرچه ترامپ اونقدر باهوش نیست که یک عده‌ای میگن، اما اونقدر هم احمق نیست که یک عده‌ای میگن و کاری که داره میکنه اینه که چیزهایی که به طور اخلاقی زشت بودن و مثلا میچ مک‌کانل انجام میداد ولی به طور پنهانی خدمتگزار یک روح شروری بود پشت سر خودش، دونالد ترامپ بدون شرم انجام میده و ترویج میکنه و این رو زشتی زدایی میکنه از جامعه. ایشون دختری دارن به نام ادینا، ایشون 15 ساله هست. ادینا دوستی داره که ایشون میفرمایند که یه پدر و مادری داره که به طور سنتی به جمهوری خواه رأی میدادن و خب اشکالی هم نداشته از نظر ایشون. خب اونا به جمهوری خواه رأی میدادن، ایشون هم به دموکرات ها. اما نکته این است که اصلا در مخیله ایشون خطور نمیکرد که اون خانواده دوست داشتنی نژاد پرستی رو هم روی میز بذارن و افزون بر طرفداری از جمهوری خواه بگن که ما نژاد پرست هم هستیم. اما اتفاق تو این 4 سال افتاده. Jack, what would happen if Trump couldn't beat Biden?
It's a large question. I think probably nothing. Right. I think most likely what will happen if Biden wins is that over the next 6 weeks, the Republican Congress will work very, very hard to get legislation passed that they couldn't get passed, and work very, very hard while they're still in power to do Republican things. Meanwhile, Donald Trump will bluster and complain and sow division, and there will be a few ugly incidences in the United States, but mostly it will be fine. And then he'll claim he refuses to leave, and then he'll leave the White House. Or if he doesn't leave, the Secret Service will lift him up by the collar and move him out. I think that is probably what will happen. In the process, there will be lawsuits, there will be other things, but it depends on how wide the lead is by. If it is perfectly clear in lots of different states that Biden just won by a lot, and if he has a lot of electoral votes, that will happen. If it's very close, then it will be a lot more complicated, and the courts will get involved, and the Trump appointees will get involved, and they will try to overturn the election. And then it's anybody's guess. There may very well be pockets of violence. And if there are, I will say that in itself is horrible, but noteworthy, because the thing that America does as good as it does anything is peaceful transitions of power. The transition between Reagan and Clinton were fairly opposing philosophies. The transition between Clinton and Bush, the transition between Bush and Obama and Trump were perfectly peaceful. When Richard Nixon resigned the presidency, and Gerald Ford, who was not an elected vice president, took office, it was a peaceful transition of power. If there is violence in the United States, and even a little violence, even small amounts of violence, it will be the first time since Lincoln that there was a violent transition, and there wasn't even a violent transition in Lincoln. There was a succession during Lincoln's term that then led to the Civil War. And it will be a terrible blemish on the memory of Donald Trump if there's any violence at all. And the people who he riles up are very, very unpredictable. And I will be honest that there are a lot of people who, including myself, who are worried about that. And it all will depend on, I think, how close the vote is and what Donald Trump does rhetorically the night of the election and the week after the election. If we can get through the election, if we can get 3-4 days or a week past the election, then I think whatever happens, we're fine. But I could be wrong about that. And honestly, I don't know.
Thank you. خب احتمال دیگر رو در نظر گرفتیم. چه اتفاقی میفته اگه بایدن رای بیاره و ترامپ رای نیاره؟ اگر خیلی اختلاف زیاد باشه تقریبا هیچ اتفاقی، یعنی تو این چند ماهی که جمهوری خواها در قدرت هستن تا اونجا که میتونن کارهای جمهوری خواهانه، قوانین جمهوری خواهانه تصویب میکنن و کارهای جمهوری خواهانه انجام میدن تمام میشه. اما اگر تو اون ایالت‌هایی که دعوا بالا میگیره اون حاشیه خیلی کم باشه و بایدن نتونه با قوت ببره، اون وقت ممکنه که جنگ داخلی در امریکا اتفاق بیفته، حتی اگر احتمالش خیلی کم باشه و حتی اگر کمیت و کیفیتش خیلی کم باشه. این نخستین بار از زمان ابراهام لینکلن تا الان خواهد بود که جنگ داخلی اتفاق میفته در انتقال قدرت. چون میدونید انتقال قدرت در امریکا خیلی صلح آمیزه و همه به نتیجه انتخابات گردن می‌نه و اگر ترامپ این کار رو نکنه این احتمال وجود داره که خشونت حتی به صورت کم اتفاق بیفته، ولی خب این یک مبنای بدی خواهد بود برای امریکا چون سابقه نداشته از اون زمان که از زمان لینکلن به این بعد که حتی در زمان لینکلن هم ترانزیشن انتقال قدرت نبود که با جنگ مواجه شد. انتقال قدرت در امریکا با صلح انجام میشه معمولا، ولی اگر حاشیه برد بایدن خیلی بالا نباشه ممکنه که اتفاقاتی از این جنس بیفته. Jack, we have 15 minutes and I would like to ask you which kind of election you think is better. Do you think maybe it is time to change in the kind of election and electoral colleges in the US and have a kind of European election in the US, or you think that it still has its own advantages, and if it does, what are its advantages?
Well, I think first of all, having a two-party system is no longer viable. That there are really four major parties in the United States right now. There's the Republican, the religious conservative Republicans, and then the free market Republicans. And they're very, very opposed to one another, but they're in the same organization. So free market Republicans are forced, for example, to be pro-gun or religious ones as well. I mean, or pro-choice.
Sorry to interrupt you. What about libertarians and Tea Party?
Well, so free market Republicans include libertarians, and the Tea Party is a little more complicated because they think they're libertarians, but they're not. So, but there's basically two versions of the Republican Party: the social conservatives and the economic conservatives. And the same is true in the Democrats, that there are the social Democrats and the economic Democrats. The social Democrats are people who are arguing for expanded social freedoms, again, like women's rights and gay rights and civil rights and those sorts of things. And then there's the economic Democrats who are arguing for things like greater entitlement programs, welfare, healthcare, things like that. They have more of an overlap than the Republicans do. But if there were four parties, the Democratic Party would split in two as well. Which is and the leaders of those two parties in the Democrats were Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and it should have been Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren, but America has a sexism problem, and Elizabeth Warren was never taken seriously. So the first thing is that we have to deal with the two-party system. The Electoral College has one merit, and that merit is that if it were a straight-up popular election, then the urban centers would make all of the decisions for everybody, and rural America would be ignored. And that's a problem. At the same time, the winner-take-all model of the Electoral College, where every state, all the electors go to the one winner, that also alters the balance. So a state like North Dakota with 650,000 people has more power in relation to a state like California than it probably should. So the first step would be to avoid the winner-take-all, but I think that in the end, the Electoral College is obsolete. And in the end, there has to be tremendous reform. However, those big issues hide the fact that there are lots of things that we could do within the system to improve the system as it is. For example, make Election Day a national holiday. Require early voting, 2 weeks worth of early voting, or 3 weeks worth of early voting everywhere. Not require advanced registration to vote, or have what they call same-day registration. Have much more accessible polling places, and many more of those polling places. You can do all of those things because if the, and I will say, although this is a little more controversial, make voting mandatory, or at least make there some sort of penalty for not voting. And what I would do is I would make voting mandatory and then give perhaps a none of the above option, right? So you can vote for all of the candidates, but you can also say, I'm voting, I'm engaging in my right to vote, but I'm still choosing nobody. Make not voting an active choice rather than a passive choice.
Here in Iran, some people vote for themselves.
Right, right. And so there's write-in votes, right? Yes, yes. And so if everyone in America voted, and if everyone in America had access to vote, and if the election finance laws were reformed, and the nature of the debates were different, and there were more inclusive voices, then the problems of the two-party system and the problems of the Electoral College would have less influence, less power. But because only 50% of Americans vote, and because a lot of people don't get to vote because they're prevented from voting, then the shortcomings of our system are exponentially increased. And so on the one hand, I understand why you asked the question. It's a tremendously important question, and it is the question of our time. But on the other hand, when you ask that question, it makes it seem like the only kind of changes you can make are the systemic constitutional changes, when in fact the vast majority of problems in the United States with voting involve local enforcement and local laws and access, which then goes back to our initial conversation, which is, are the voting laws advocating for voters and making it easier for people to vote, or are the voting laws to be can make the laws promote voting, automatically the process will become better.
Thank you, Jack. پرسیدم درباره این که ما وقتی هم دیگه نداریم، برای نحوه برگزاری انتخابات و کالج رای الکترال در امریکا گفتم خب چه مزایایی داره، چه معایبی داره. مزیت اصلیش خب همون چیزی که جیمز مدیسون در فدرالیست شماره 10 گفته، یعنی tyranny of majority رو جلوش رو میگیره، جلوی ستمگری زورگویی اکثریت رو میگیره و رأی حاشیه ها هم به حساب میاد، وگرنه چند شهر بزرگ تا ابد میتونستن رئیس جمهور رو همیشه انتخاب کنن. بعد فرمودن که خب سوال دیگه میتونه این باشه که اصلا این سیستم دو حزبی در امریکا دیگه کار نمیکنه، دست کم چند حزب ما در خود جمهوری خواهد داریم، مثل تی پارتی، مثل لیبرتاریان ها، مثل اوانجلیست ها، و در قسمت چپ ما یعنی لیبرال سوشال داریم، یعنی لیبرالی که به آزادی های اجتماعی، به ارزش های اجتماعی اهمیت میده، و لیبرال اکانومیک داریم که به ارزش های اقتصادی اهمیت میده. بنابراین سیستم دو حزبی هم دیگه کار نمیکنه در امریکا. بله اینها در خاطرم ما. Jack, we have 5 minutes, and let me thank you for accepting my invitation. And if you want to say anything as the end of this interview, we would like to hear. And we would like to be able to congratulate you and your near and dear on Tuesday.
Thank you very much. This is a deep honor. It's something I enjoy, and I value both our friendship and our working relationship, and I am incredibly grateful to all of your students and colleagues who follow me on my social networks. It always makes me very happy. I will say this. Donald Trump is not a failure of liberal democracy. Donald Trump is an indication of the breakdown of liberal democracy. If the democracy operated properly, he wouldn't be the president. Now, there may be a president whom I deeply disagreed with. There may be a leader who people object to on different ways. But the failures here are failures that you see in many, many other countries. A poor education system, a desperate economic situation, a circumstance in which people view their neighbor as competitors rather than partners, propaganda that appeals to ignorance and bigotry that is already in the system, right? So Donald Trump has not said anything that isn't already part of the American psyche. So as a political philosopher who has been a political philosopher my entire adult life, it is very, very hard for me to look at this and to proceed with my research because I feel like it has failed in some important way.
We have only 20 seconds. Right. Thank you very much for everything. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.